periods to 3 and left out one. It's the I don't remember what I said, but I was knocked in my truck. And that's not right. 4 batch of periods in David's career. We're going to start with the first one today. They are his rise to prominence, number 1. The fugitive period, that's the one I think I left out. His rise to power, and then his mature, quotes around it, rank. Let's start with, and there was discussion before class about, it boils down to the fact that David's rather enigmatic. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? And I tell my students, when people force you to answer yes or no, or clear dichotomous, the answer is usually both or yes. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? Yes. Let's start with David's rise to prominence. Now, I should tell you that the earliest traditions in ancient Israel, Saul, I think I mentioned this last time, we saw it already with Saul, considered the whole business of becoming king to be a 2-stage process. One, God identifies someone, and that's usually indicated by the fact that a prophet anoints them. That's where we get Messiah from, anointed. It's important to remember that Messiah with a capital M refers in our thinking to Jesus, but before Jesus there were 40 or 50 Messiah. Every king of Israel was anointed to that job, and that's what Messiah means, the anointed one. So after being anointed, we have experiences in Israel where some crazy dude calling himself a prophet would anoint somebody. I mean, think about the fact that in order to become king of Israel, all you had to do was get someone who called himself a prophet to anoint you. And then that was supposed to mean automatically that, yes, that's God's will. Imagine if we had religious leaders in America anointing our president. We have a new president every other day, and none of them would be worth having, probably. Right? So there has to be a second phase in which, if in fact this individual is God's choice for the job, then the people should be able to see in that individual some quality or characteristic or behavior that indicates in fact that God has chosen you. And so we think of that as ratification. Now, in David's case, if you know the story well, and I have to be disciplined this morning, there are passages I want us to actually read and hear the biblical story, the biblical wording, because it's important. There are others I can tell you or even just remind you of, and we can move on, and I can put them in context. So I'm going to try to be as disciplined as I can, because we have 3 weeks to do 4 periods. You know the story that after Saul's 3 strikes, you're out, and Samuel says God is going to give your kingdom into the hand of another. 1 Samuel 16, the very beginning, God says to Samuel, why are you still grieving over Saul? Let's pick up and move on. I want you to go to Jesse the Bethlehemite. I have picked out already the next king of Israel among his sons. I want you to go anoint him. And it's indicative of Saul's state of mind that Samuel is afraid to go on this journey because he's afraid that Saul will figure out what he's up to and prevent him or even kill him. And God says, well, go down there and say you're offering a sacrifice. Take something with you to sacrifice. You know this story. Samuel goes there and says to Jesse, God's going to anoint the next king of Israel from among your sons. Let me see them all. And turns out there are 8. The 7 come before Samuel one at a time. And God doesn't, no, none of them. And you know what Samuel says? I want to see them all. Is this everybody? Jesse said, well, I got this little kid of a boy, as my granddad used to say. He's surely not a possibility. He's just wet behind the ears still. He's out tending the sheep. And Samuel says, no, I need to see him. I think I've already gotten ahead of the text I wanted to read. When Samuel said, I don't find none of these are working. Verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. You remember I said that an important concept for this historical literature is the concept of irony. And already this episode where all of Jesse's sons parade before Samuel raises that question. Irony is An ironic moment is that moment in which there's an opportunity to see more than is evident on the surface. And the question always is, do you see it? Right. And God himself announces here that the theme of David's life is going to be the difference between appearance and reality when it comes to David. And so they bring David in, and I want to read that. Verse 12 of 1 Samuel 16. He sent and brought him in. Now, he was ruddy. Red to play. In the Hebrew Bible, that's important because that description applies also to someone in the patriarchal generation. Anybody have a memory of who it might be? Esau. Esau's very name means red. He was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. So now, God has said, we don't look on the outward appearance. That doesn't matter. And how is David described? In terms of his tan, got pretty. I've always been amazed. There's something to it, but I've noted it in every generation. My brother, apparently, to hear all the women in my family, when he was a little boy, had beautiful eyes. I looked at him and I saw my brother with eyes. That's what I saw. One of my sons, everybody, all the women would say, "Ooh, what beautiful eyes! You're going to be a lady killer." And I looked at him and I said, looks like my brother. I don't see it. You think that was awful. I don't see it. So here's David with the beautiful eyes. You can bet that David's father and his brothers and his uncles didn't notice this. So do you see all of the questions after God having said, don't look on his appearance. What is described? What about his heart? Do we hear anything about his heart? Does he sound like, when you're looking for a king or a president, what do you want? Tanned, pretty eyes, good-looking guy. Is that what you're looking at? Robert Redford. Right? Rise and anoint him, for this is the one, so he did. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah, where he is from. Now, the very next verse. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. So, here's the situation. From that moment on, we have two people who are anointed king of Israel. One of them still on the throne. But the Lord has departed from him. And there's this little young shepherd, good-looking, cute, tan, pretty-eyed little boy. And the Spirit of the Lord is with him mightily. If you don't have a sense for irony, you need to develop one, or the David story is not going to work. This is so, here's Saul, has been successful in battle, grown man, armor, and here's little. So now, the whole next period of David's life, Samuel has done this anointing in private. I'm not even sure if David's older brothers were present at the time, the way the story reads. No more than Samuel, Jesse, David, and maybe his brothers, but I doubt it, know what has just transpired. And if you take out an ad in the paper, Saul, who we will see is jealous and crazy, is likely just to come and do what? Kill him. So now the question is, how do you get from this secret little boy anointment to the place where Israel is ready to ratify David as its king? And the next phase of the story answers part of that question, how David comes to promise. I'm going to zip over some stuff because you know already. In ancient historiography, and this would be an example of the first attempt at history writing in Israel's culture. And I'll remind you, it was probably composed in the 580s or 570s, and these events took place 400 years earlier. Right. So any tradition about it will have come down orally, in maybe individual written accounts, so on and so forth. It turns out the question of how David came now to Saul's attention, how he ended up at court, there are two answers to that. The immediate answer, the first version of the story, tells about how after the Spirit of God departed from Saul and an evil spirit, by the way, that's a bad translation. The Hebrew word that's translated evil there means simply bad. Evil has a moral connotation. The word translated evil here can just mean aggravating spirit or, bad mood. Comes upon Saul. And his counselors think, well, maybe what he needs is some music therapy. And somebody said, we've heard of this kid of a boy up in Bethlehem who's a fine folk singer. Let's get him to, now in my mind I think of John Denver. Anyway, so they fetch David to court, and sure enough, he plays, the Bible says he plays the lyre with his hand, as opposed to his foot or something, and sings, and it calms Saul's mood, usually. Very early on one occasion, it's accounted here, it didn't work. You have to imagine maybe David sitting at the back of the room playing background music. The Bible says that Saul got ticked and grabbed his spear and chucked it at David. And David ducked. That ends up happening 3 times over the course of the next several chapters, which raises a question in my mind about David. How many times do I have to chunk a spear at you because I want you to change the channel, so play a different song, whatever, before you leave my service? 3 times, and it didn't affect David. He hung around. So now David is the king's music therapist, and he's at court. The next chapter tells us the story of David and Goliath. Now, one of the reasons we know we have 2 sources, and they're not real well related to each other, they probably came from different traditions, and the author just put them both in here, is because when David identifies himself to Saul as being willing to take on Goliath, Saul doesn't know who he is. So how come he doesn't recognize his music therapy? Well, it's independent stories. The David and Goliath story says that David came to the attention of the king and ended up at the court by, and you know the story, by volunteering and being successful. Think about the irony that we've already encountered. The next king of Israel comes to prominence because he's a folk singer. Or the next king of Israel comes to prominence because as a little boy, he's arrogant enough to step forward with a slingshot and do battle with a Philistine giant. Right? Think of the irony of that picture. We've all seen that since Vacation Bible School. The thing to remember, of course, is that we know, because the author has told us, maybe David knows, if he doesn't fully recognize what he knows, and Samuel knows, that he can he will be successful in these things because why? Because God is with him. Right. After that episode with Goliath, let's see. Where do we go? Where do I go? Here we go. Chapter 18. One of the questions that comes about now is who begins to recognize who David is without being told? David doesn't tell anyone, I'm the anointed. Who begins to see, just from the evidence of David's life, that maybe God's hand is on him? The first recorded for us is Saul's son, Jonathan. Chapter 18, verse 1. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. And that's enough to say about that. So Jonathan has caught on, so forth. As they were coming home, when David returned from killing the Philistine, the women came out of all the towns of Israel, singing and dancing. to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they made merry. This was the substance of their song. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000. How many, in fact, has David killed? One. But the women, do you get, I mean, there were chuckles, and they're supposed to be chuckles. Here he is. I mean, we're beginning to get near perfection in some circumstances. He's young, he's handsome, got pretty eyes, melodious, sweet voice, plays the guitar really well, and can kill Philistine giants. Woo. Every mother in Israel wanted him for a son-in-law. They all come out and sing it. Ooh, he is their darling. By the way, David's name probably was not David. There's an alternative account of the killing of a giant later in the Bible, and it gives another name. David means darling in Hebrew. Sweetie pie. Honey bunch. Right? It's a nickname. Yes?
You passed over, isn't the attachment of Jonathan to David pretty ironic in itself?
I mean, it's self-defeating for Jonathan, and will be self-defeating later. If you follow it, by the way, so far, Israel has one king, another anointed in the wings. A new monarchy, they don't yet have established a tradition of how they select the successor to a king. This is going about establishing that tradition. By the time David is on the throne, the tradition will be shifted to a dynastic principle. In other words, David's son. It could have become a dynastic kingdom under Saul, in which case Jonathan would have been the next king. But Jonathan, throughout, beginning with this point and onward, shows more loyalty to David than he does to his father and to his own prospects to be king in the future. So yeah, that's very odd. And Jonathan's sister, who? Michal, becomes David's wife, and she behaves the same way. So it's very ironic. They see in David something that at this point in David's life, I don't think David has yet seen and understood, even though he knows himself to be anointed. A whole series of things. By the way, I should read Saul's reaction to the women's song. Saul was very angry, for this saying displeased him. He said to himself, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. What more can he have but my kingdom?" Indeed, Samuel said he was going to anoint someone. This kid, and the text says, so Saul eyed David from that day on. Saul has become suspicious that David, in fact, is his successor. And Saul undertakes a series of maneuvers, which I won't try. I may not get them in the right order, but I just want to give you the idea. He decides, okay, let's take this singer boy, lucky shot with a slingshot one time, and I'm going to make him a major in the army and put him out in charge of a whole group of troops in battle, and let's see how he does. Right? What's his military experience? Herding sheep. Right? He's surely, he's not going to. What happens? The text says that David went out before Israel, and led them. What happened? He was successful. Why? And instead of getting him killed, which is what I think Saul hoped would happen, his reputation in Israel grew. Okay, that didn't work. Right? So Saul calls David in and says, I think one of the most humorous passages in the Bible, and says, no, he doesn't call him in, he sends word, they have people, he has his people contact David's people, and said, like junior high school, may we go ask Steve if, and so they go ask David whether, Saul wants to know if he might be interested in Michal's hand. Well, at first it's Merab, her older sister, but that doesn't work out, and then it's Michal. Would you like to marry her? And David says, well, I'd be amenable to that, but I'm not wealthy and don't have a dowry that would be to pay that would be suitable for a princess. And they go back and tell Saul. So I said, well, we can work something out. I will accept a dowry of 100 Philistine foreskins. And David says, okay, deal. Now let's think about that. Well, yeah. What is going to be necessary in order to attain this dowry? David's not going to take out an ad in the paper and say, would you please be willing to donate to me? Among the Philistines. He's going to have to what?
Kill him.
100 of them, one at a time, and come back. David says, sure. Now, what does Saul hope for? By the time you've harvested 100 Philistine foreskin, the 73rd guy is going to kill you instead, or the 43rd, or the 2nd, because that's going to be a fight to the death, right there. Amen. Amen. A couple of days later, David comes in with more than 200. The Septuagint says 1,000. The Hebrew says 200 Philistine foreskin. And it passes over the whole episode of David bringing them in and saying, Saul, here they are. I just imagine a Broadway, satire on this or something, in which David comes in with whatever kind of container, plops them down in front of Saul and says, they're all there, count them. And I can imagine Saul saying, oh no, I'll take your word for it, or turn into somebody who was down low on the totem pole and is not in his best graces today and say, you count all of those. So, rather than getting David killed, what happens? Now David is a prince by marriage in Israel. Married to the king's daughter. At this point, Saul decides, okay, this is not working. These indirect methods of getting David killed have ceased, they haven't succeeded. And he starts more direct methods. You know the story, he has somebody sneak in David's bed at night and try to assassinate him. But Michal has gotten word of this already. And they snuck David out in the night. And then instead put in his bed a statuette and a ruddy, it makes it clear, red-headed goat skin, right? And so Saul's soldiers sneak in there and just whack the heck out of that statue. Find out that David's escaped. He tried. David's out away from home, and Saul sends Jonathan to go talk to him and to say to him, Dad's really upset. He thinks there's been a misunderstanding. He misses you. He loves you. Wants to know when you're going to be back home. And David, by the way, throughout this, has been as naive as you can possibly be. The text reminds us about this time that Saul chunked a spear at him a couple of times more while he was playing. How long does it take before you catch on this guy's trying to kill me? Especially after he tries to have you assassinated in your bed at night. After that, even, when Jonathan says, Dad wants you to come home, David says, guess what? Sure, be happy. Jonathan says, no, whoa, slow down. Can't you see, irony, can't you see what's going on here? Don't you get a clue? He said, let me do this instead. Let me have a series of conversations with Dad and see if I can discern what his true intentions are. And let's meet in this field in a few days. And I will bring a servant with me. And I'll bring my bow and arrow. And I'll play like I'm taking some target practice. And I'll shoot the bow and arrow. And when I send the servant out to fetch them, I will say one of two things. I will say, no, they went farther than that. And that will be your sign. One is by land, two is by sea. That will be your sign that you need to get out of here because Dad means to kill you. And if I say, no, I didn't shoot them that far, they're back this way, that will be your sign that you can come out of hiding and you can go home. Now, why would Jonathan insist on David being in hiding for this? You have any ideas about that? because he does. He insists that David, you hide behind this rock.
Don't trust Saul.
Afraid that he'd be followed, right? If I were Saul and knew Jonathan and Saul were such friends, and I wanted to find David, anytime Jonathan left home, I'd have him followed. And that's what Jonathan's afraid of. So what does Jonathan discover? Well, he discovers that Saul, in fact, means to kill David. That's all there is to it. So he shoots his bow and arrow, and he says, no, no, they went farther than that. And David steps out from behind the rock and says, oh, you mean I'm going to have to run away? And Jonathan says, you know, why do we go to all this trouble to keep you hidden if you're just going to, right now, when it's the moment of truth, you step out from behind the rock and say, hey, y'all, how you doing? Gomer says, hey. Goober says, hey, back. What is this? Right? You know, you can put your cartridge in your gun now, Barney. I mean, David seems to be so naive and innocent and sweet and kind and stupid because of it. Or arrogant because he knows that the Lord's hand is upon him. What does the text say? It doesn't. So, we're supposed to, the question of irony is, what do you see? This is a good moment to pause because we've come to the end of David's rise to prominence. By this time, he's the king's court musician. He's famous for the Goliath episode. He's a major or a colonel or something in the army. He's won significant battles against the Philistines. Everybody knows the foreskin story. He's Michal's husband, Jonathan, and Jonathan's his best friend, and Michal is protecting him against her own father. By the way, Saul has nasty things to say about his two children at one point in here because of their loyalty to David instead of to him. And he's out in the woods, finding out that he's going to have to leave home, right? What do you think about him at this point as a prospective king of Israel? What do you think about his character at this point? How would you describe him? Yes, please.
How old was he at this point?
By this time, you have to think that when he was anointed, he was, 12. By this time, he's fought some battles and been a major and a colonel, and married. So he's 19, 20 at this point. Yes.
Has he written songs during this period?
No. Mostly he will have written folk songs, probably.
Getting experience to write.
He has to have something to write about, but he doesn't yet. Others?
Is he naive?
He's very naive, sweet, innocent, I think. I mean, the text is open to two readings. One is that he's arrogantly confident of the Lord's hand upon him, so he takes makes reckless decisions, reckless choices. Or that he just, Saul says, come home. He goes, okay, I'll come home. But, and Jonathan has to say, whoa, put the brakes on. Do you trust my dad that much, David? I don't trust my dad that much. Now we enter the second phase. And this is what all we'll do today. We'll try to leave this time for questions. It's a very complicated series of events, and I have trouble keeping the sequence in order. So I'm going to just use some key ones, some key episodes to give us an idea of what this was like. Saul was out to get David. By this time, there was no more subtlety. Right? David fled the best he could. He stopped at Nob in Ob, and the priests there took care of him. To give you an idea of how serious Saul was, word came back to Saul that the priests of Nob had taken care of David, and he sent out some troops and had them all killed. So it's pretty serious business. David hides his parents in Edom because he's afraid of, you have to think of, in modern contexts, some of these sort of third world countries where, you're in power if you're in power, but there's somebody else who will knock you off and they'll be in power. And so you better be paying attention. And that's what Saul was afraid of, and that's how Saul behaves. We learn that, to begin with, David goes down into the Negev. On Western maps, it'll be listed as the Negev Desert. But what Negev means is southern desert. So, like the Sahara is Arabic for desert. So, Sahara Desert is the desert. The Rio Grande River is the big river. The Potomac River is the river. Anyway, and the Teton Mountains are the mountains. I get thinking about them. So he goes to the Negev, and he's by himself pretty much, but his days as a shepherd boy, he's able to, word about all of this gets out across the region, and before long, David has assembled, think of Robin Hood and his merry men. David has assembled a band of 600 outlaws, tax evaders, criminals. They're described in Hebrew as a vagabond bunch. And they have become important later because when he becomes king, this 600 person, what we call personal army, who owe allegiance directly to David, whether he's king of Israel or not. Yeah, they're his. They stay with him throughout his reign and are the reason he survives as king later on. But they're down here. At first, he's able to kind of shift around and do okay, but when you end up with 600 and they brought their families with them, there are several episodes recorded of Saul hearing that David was down about, such and such a place, and he quickly rounded up his troops and went down there, and David just barely escaped. But when you get to be 600, then that's not so easy to do. One of those, by the way, there's an important chapter that we're going to look at, 1 Samuel 25. I think it's 25 or 24, but I think it's 25. On either side, 24 and 26, another doublet, we call them, two versions of the same story, in which Saul has just about got, one of them, I'll tell you, that's one of my favorite. David is down there somewhere in the south with a handful of his men. Saul just about catches him. They see him coming, and David says, let's hide in this cave right quick. So they hide in the cave. Saul mounts the hill and down the other side, and he goes, somebody hold my horse, I gotta go pee. And I'm gonna go in this cave right here. And the text says that Saul chose as his station just the other side of the rock David was hiding behind. And David's men say, this is your chance, he's gonna be not in a fighting stance here in a minute. And you can really, and there's throughout, David insists, I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. Another ironic statement. David repeats it. In other words, Saul may not be the best, but he is the Lord's anointed. And I may be the Lord's anointed, but that doesn't mean I want to commit that crime. There's that noble way of reading it. Another way of reading it is to say that I am the Lord's anointed, and if I establish the precedent that the next anointed of the Lord can hasten his route to the throne by murdering the sitting king, then that's a precedent I don't want to establish. Yes.
But David's not doing anything
To protect himself.
He's not claiming any land,
No.
right? He's not doing anything to usurp Saul's. He's not trying to do anything to undermine the power.
That's right. That's almost right. We'll see in a minute.
Okay.
But everything he's doing is undermining Saul's power. Because his success contrasts with Saul's failure. And so the people loved David. His marriage, his friendship with Jonathan undermines Saul's claim to a successor on the throne. His marriage to me, so he's not doing it in the sense of calling Saul out and saying, I'm going to kill you, but everything is having the effect of undermining Saul's authority.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that he's causing it.
That's right.
It could be.
That's right.
It could be
That's
a
right.
beneficence of.
Well, see, these are all the questions. If you read this story, the storyteller is very reticent. No. The storyteller absolutely refrains from interpreting. Right. Except to remind us from time to time that the Lord's hand was upon David. So you could argue from the text that Saul was being undermined, surely, and the cause or author of that was God.
Right.
You could argue that. You could also argue, one of my former colleagues wrote a book about the question of what would have happened had Saul said, it's apparent to me that you will be my successor. let me help you learn how to do that. What would have happened? What would have been the outcome then? Right? These are all questions that, sometimes the whole irony thing asks you, do you see this? But the next question is, if you see what's really going on, now, how are you reacting to it? You can argue from a reading of the text that Saul was, Saul announced that suspicion, what more can he have than my kingdom? So Saul may have been as aware as anybody that David was the next to follow. He didn't have to react to that the way he did. He could have accepted God's decision in that regard, and the story would have gone otherwise. It's a very complex, in that regard, account of how things went. And it raises all kinds of questions. But anyway, I want to finish this with David and Saul, on the other side of the rock. Rather than kill Saul, he took his knife and sliced off a bit of his robe. And Saul finished his business and went out, mounted the hill on the other side, on his search for David. And David came out of the cave and yelled across the way, "Saul!" Right? And Saul says, "Oh, I've come to bring you home. I love you. I miss you. I want you to come home." And David said, yeah, right. I've learned by now what that means. But he says, "I want you to know," and he holds up a piece of the robe and said, "Do you recognize this?" He said, I am not out to get you. I'm paraphrasing. I was close enough to you just about 15 minutes ago to get this, and you didn't know I was anywhere around. I could have just as easily killed you. Now, leave me alone. Chapter 25 intervenes, and then there's chapter 26, which tells a very similar story about David coming into the camp at night and being close enough to kill him and steal his spear and so forth. Then waking him up and say, "I was just down there and didn't kill you." Now, whenever the Bible has two versions of something, and the biblical author doesn't choose one, but uses them instead to make a bracket around something, and as is the case here, biblical authors do that a lot. Even in the New Testament, there's a famous technique of Mark. He will interrupt a story to put a vignette in the middle and then finish the story. And that usually means you should interpret what's inside in terms of the brackets on the outside. Right? It's called a Markan sandwich in the New Testament. A Markan sandwich, because Mark likes to do it. And the meat is important, the bread is too. So you have to know what to do. We have this in 24 and 26, two versions of the same story. That makes us want to know what's in 25. And I'm going to tell that story. It's the story of Abigail. There's a fellow up about Carmel by the name of Nabal. His name means lecherous fool. Probably not what his parents named him. Probably a nickname. He was married to a woman, the Bible tells us she was clever and beautiful. Now, one of the things I wrote an article several years ago about, and I was startled to discover this. The Bible, the Old Testament, doesn't talk about people being beautiful very often. It's only a handful of folks. David is described as being handsome, Yaphet. Abigail is described as being beautiful, Yaphet, Yaphah. So it's one word in Hebrew, it just has gender. And the people who are described as being beautiful in the Bible are the matriarchs, Sarah and Rebekah, Joseph, just before he got into trouble because Potiphar's wife saw he was so beautiful, David, Abigail, and David's sons, Absalom and Adonijah, David's daughter, Tamar, and not many more people. Now, what do you recognize about that group of people? In every instance, when the Bible describes them as being beautiful, that's just before the Pharaoh takes you, Sarah, into his harem. It's just before Potiphar's wife accuses you of rape. It's just before Tamar gets raped by her brother. It's just before Absalom, his life is taken by Joab, his uncle, because he's rebelled against his father. It's just before Adonijah rebels against Solomon and loses his life. So the Bible sort of inadvertently suggests that being beautiful gets you into trouble. Right? So here we go. Abigail is beautiful and clever. David, this is during his fugitive period. They're wondering, how do you sustain an army of 600 men in a desert. If you stop and plant crops and are stationary for long enough to grow some corn, that's long enough for Saul to find you. Right. So how do you live? Well, here David sends word to Nabal. Now, I hear you had shearers up about Carmel. It was fall harvest time. And we were in the vicinity, and we didn't rob you. Now, I've sent this group of messengers to you. Give them some presents and send them back. Now, let's break that. What do you call that? My army was there, and we didn't rob you. Now pay us.
Extortion.
Call extortion, that's right. Nabal says, I ain't got to do it. I'm not paying you for not robbing me. You rebel, you're not loyal to your master anyway. Hound dog is what you are, and I'm not going to do it. David's men come back and tell what Nabal has said. David's mad at everything. He says, every man of you mount and strap on your sword. And I'm quoting the King James. And David himself strapped on his sword. And they head out to get Nabal. Meanwhile, Abigail hears about it from a servant. And she says, oh my Lord goodness, what has he done, this idiot? He's going to get us all killed. And she says, here, let's load up a bunch of gifts on donkeys. You go ahead on, I'll be along in a little bit. I always wonder why she says I'll be along in a little bit. Ladies, why do you think she just didn't go with them to begin with? She says, I'll be along in a little bit.
She got dressed and put makeup on.
Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Now, by the way, I want to comment on this, especially the Old Testament, but the New Testament too. Asks you to read these stories with some imagination, right? But to know the difference between what you're imagining and what's written. So I might say, I think it's probable that she got dolled up. The text does not say that. But I can't think of any other reason why she would say, I'll be along in a little bit. Anytime my wife has said, I'll be along. Anytime my daughter says, I'll be along in a little bit. Anytime my mother, my aunt, my grandmother ever said, I'll be along in a little bit, I know what that meant. Right? And I doubt if it's changed since those days. So David's, and these donkeys loaded down with stuff start arriving. And pretty soon Abigail arrives, and she falls off the camel, off the donkey, like Rebecca fell off the camel. And she said, my Lord, Nabal's his name, and that's what he is. And don't raise your hand and be guilty of murder in avenging your own, slight against you. The Lord's going to take care of you. All of it. And by the way, when you come into your kingdom, she says, remember your maidservant. When you get to be king, don't forget little old me. And David says, well, okay, you talked me out of it. Everything's okay. She goes home. And she waits. I think I'll read this because this is just worth
Tell me
reading.
where you are.
I'm in 1 Samuel 25. Here we go. I'm beginning reading at verse 36. Abigail came to Nabal. He was holding a feast in his house. This will be, the harvest festival. They've just finished harvest. Like the feast of a king, Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him. He became like a stone. Now, again, I see why y'all are looking at me like, I don't get it. Imagine this. Why didn't she tell him? He's ill-tempered, right? We know this. And she has basically betrayed him. She has done what he refused to do. And she's going to tell him. Did she have to tell him about it? No. But she's going to tell him about it. Why? She wants to stick his nose in it. She doesn't tell him when he's drunk, because then he'd be likely to be in a good mood or forget about it by the next. She wants him stone cold sober so that he hears it. And she says, And I loaded up all the stuff, and I got all made up nice, and I went and called him my lord and told him not to mess with you because you're a fool. That's your name, you know, fool. And I told him to remember me when he, you know, and she told, and he you can imagine, he just, you know, really good. That's basically what the text says. You can imagine him having that apoplectic fit. And he died some days later, 10 days later. Verse 39. Now, we're interested in David. And I've said that this chapter is emphasized by this bracket. What have we learned about him so far? In order to survive, he was willing to resort to a form of extortion. Right? We've learned that he has a temper. This is not the naive little boy of the first period of his life. This is a man who's willing to get even. Right? When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord. Teach him to mess with me." Verse 39. Then David sent and wooed Abigail to make her his wife. Her name, by the way, means Daddy's darling. When David's servants came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, "David has sent us to you to take you to him as his wife." Are you getting this picture? Her husband's been dead for a while, 10 days. Up rides this entourage from David, says, "Get in, we're taking you back to be his wife." And it uses the word wooed. Boy, that's some wooing, isn't it? That wouldn't have worked so well. How was her response? What do you think she did? She rose, bowed to the ground, loaded up stuff. 42. Abigail got up hurriedly and rode away on a donkey. Her 5 maids attended her. She went after the messengers of David and became his wife. Who wooed who?
She made the first move.
Yeah. Now this is for you. David also married Ahinoam of Jezreel. Both of them became his wives. This is after Michal. Right. Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Palti, son of Laish, who was from Galilee. Now, the text doesn't say here, so you have to get out your concordance or something and look up and see who Ahinoam of Jezreel was. And unless there were 2 Ahinoams of Jezreel, this woman was Saul's wife.
Oh, dear.
Unless there were 2. Now we begin to meet the David of his mature life. See woman, want woman, take woman. Need food? Take food. Extort it. Someone offends me? Get even. I'll end this period of his life. He continues this sort of duplicity in relationship to a Philistine king. It gets cumbersome, this army. And a Philistine king says, you know, I will hire your army as mercenaries, Achish of Gath. And in payment, I'll give you this border town, Ziklag. It's just got a wall around it. You'll be safe from Saul because it's almost in Philistia, and all you got to do is whistle and we'll come to help. And David takes the job. Now, if you're a mercenary in the employment of the Philistines, that means you fight against the Philistines' enemies. Who is that? Israel. And if you want to be king of Israel, you cannot very well make your name by being a mercenary in the employment of the Philistines, fighting against Israel. Okay. So David would march out from Ziklag in the direction of Israel and get out of sight, turn south. There are the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all those people down there who were traditional enemies of Israel. And his troops would pick a small village or small city and wipe it out. Take all the plunder and bring it home. Wipe it out so that there were no surviving witnesses. On the way home, take the same route so it looked like they were coming back from Israel, and then they'd say, boy, sure, we had a good raid in Israel today. And Philistines would say, good for you, David, you're doing exactly what we want. Meanwhile, the Israelites heard about it, and they thought, he's fooling them. Remember Jacob, duplicitous and deceitful. There are parts of the David story in which David is depicted as being like Jacob in this one. So this is working fine. The Philistines are protecting him against Saul. He's getting wealthy off the enemies of the Israelites. The Israelites know that he's being duplicitous in this way, and his reputation is growing. He's gaining military experience. This is beautiful. Until the Philistines, the 5 Philistine cities of Metapolis, Gath, Gezer, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gath, Ekron, decide that they're tired of this Saul guy. They're going to ally together and mount a campaign against him, get rid of him once and for all. Achish enlists David's troops in this, and they're aligned in the column, marching to battle, and the other 4 Philistine kings say, wait, whoa, stop. Isn't that Israelite guy? And Achish says, yeah, but he's been loyal to me. Has he been? No. He's been loyal to me all this time. It would be awful for David to march with this Philistine army and defeat the army of Israel and depose Saul after all of his efforts not to do that very thing. And so it works out. Achish calls in David and says, I don't mean to offend you. I don't feel this way. But the other 4 Philistine kings are afraid that you'll be a turncoat. And they want you to stay home. And David says, oh, you don't trust me? Oh, this just hurts me like you wouldn't believe. And Achish says, no, it's not between me and you. I trust you, but they don't. Just don't make us think about this. And David says, if I have to. And he goes, ooh, goes home and he dodges that bullet. You know what happens. In the battle, Saul and Jonathan are both killed. And David's fugitive period comes to an end. All right, let's pause here and ask questions and summarize all of this. Now, the question is, what kind of guy is David? Yes.
I was just sitting here wondering if Jesus knew the history
Knew
very
that.
well.
Oh, yes.
So he was aware of all
yes.
his ancestors'
Oh,
duplicities and.
as a matter of fact, the episode with the priests at Nob, you remember when Jesus' disciples were getting wheat grains as they passed through and the Pharisees said, they're working on the Sabbath. And Jesus told the story about David at Nob when the priests gave him the bread of the presence because he was starving. And the bread of the presence is supposed to be restricted only to Levites. And so David said,
right.
They gave David this bread. It's supposed to be restricted only to Levites because if they didn't, he would starve. Is it better to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? And the Philistines wouldn't answer because their choices were to say, the Philistines should not have done that. And that would be the same thing as saying, we wish David had starved to death. Or they could say, yeah, the Philistines should do that. In which case they would be saying, and we don't know why we're arguing with you right now because we just gave up our point. And so they didn't say anything.
That's right, I remember him quoting that. So he did know the history.
Oh,
very
yeah.
well.
Other questions or comments? What do you think about David? That's the one. What do you think about David? What do you think about God's hand in this? I will point out, it's important here. This history, remember we talked about last time, that if it's history, strictly speaking, you don't talk about God, right? This story is being told in a very historical way, except for the fact that every so often the narrator says, because God's hand was upon him. Right? So we don't know how it is that David, the Bible doesn't tell us that David went out to gather the foreskins, for example, and lo and behold, God struck 100 Philistine men dumb and blind and paralyzed so that David could do it without, We're just told that God was with him. So that we get the idea that had we been present to see with our eyes what took place, we would not have seen anything unusual except that this young boy really does get away with stuff. Right, yes.
image that occurs to me is he's Chamberlain and Churchill wrapped up in one
Yes,
person.
well, there's some of that, yeah. But remember, we're being asked, what I'm saying is we're being asked to watch this unfold, and the narrator tells us that we should know that God's involved. But the mechanisms of God's involvement are absolutely mysterious. The 4 Philistine kings not trusting David turned out to have been David's salvation in that episode. I doubt if the 4 Philistine kings thought to themselves, oh, we need to do God's bidding here and make sure that David doesn't mess up, so we're going to mistrust him. No, they mistrusted him. But it was in the nick of time for David. Whew. Right? And the Bible is telling us a story of David in which there are a lot of these moments. It always seems to work out. Irony asks us, is this in David's life coincidence, circumstance? Or is that absolute time or time for me to ask questions? Absolute time. Darn. Okay, I promise, think on these things, as Paul would say. And we will begin next class period with a few minutes of question and answer. Because, have you read David this way before? I doubt it.
Not to this degree.
Not the way it's taught in Vacation Bible School or Sunday School. That's because we pick about, David, sweet little David kills Goliath, yay God, right? David extorts, yay God.
David murders.
David murders. The Ahinoam of Jezreel thing intrigues me. We'll see you next week.
Very good.